We follow a trail that leads beneath the marble floors of Vatican City, into corridors that have been sealed for longer than most nations have existed. For nearly 1,000 years, the Catholic Church has collected documents, letters from emperors demanding obedience, their wax seals still bearing the impressions of rings that turned to dust centuries ago. Confessions of heretics who refused to recant, their words preserved long after the flames consumed them. Maps of lands that no longer exist, drawn by explorers whose ships never returned to port. Treaties signed by kings whose bloodlines ended in violence or disease, their kingdoms erased from memory, while the paper that recorded their ambitions survives. They did not simply store these records, they organized them according to systems that have evolved over generations, systems that only a trained archivist can navigate. They catalogued them in languages that scholars must study for years before they can read a single page. They decided, through processes that have never been fully disclosed to the public, who would be permitted to examine these materials and who would be turned away at the door. And somewhere in that vast collection, sealed behind protocols that have not fundamentally changed since the medieval era, there are sections that remain closed to the outside world. Not because they are empty, but because they are full. About 85 kilometers of shelving, roughly 53 miles, though even Vatican archivists acknowledge the true extent is hard to measure precisely. If you were to walk past every document in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, maintaining a steady pace without stopping to examine anything, you would walk farther than 2 marathons. You would pass through climate-controlled chambers where temperature and humidity are monitored constantly. You would descend stairs worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. You would traverse corridors where the air itself seems heavy with the weight of accumulated time. Along the way, you would pass letters written by Michelangelo, pleading for payment for his work on the Sistine Chapel, his frustration still legible in the pressure of his pen. You would pass the formal condemnation of Galileo, the document that forced one of history's greatest scientists to recant his belief that the Earth moved around the sun, a belief we now know to be true. You would pass correspondence with monarchs whose very names have been forgotten by everyone except specialized historians, kings of kingdoms that no longer exist, emperors of empires that crumbled to dust, their elaborate seals and signatures preserved while everything else they built has vanished. And then, eventually, you would reach the sections where scholars are typically not permitted to access, not closed temporarily while materials are being processed or preserved, closed long-term, closed with limited public explanation, closed in ways that have remained consistent across popes, across centuries, across all the changes that have swept through the modern world. Those sections remain, to most of us, a blank space, not because they are empty, but because access narrows as you go. In that narrowing, there is only the ordinary truth of archives. What isn't accessible becomes a blank space. The honest answer is, we do not know. And that is precisely the point. The not knowing is the engine that drives every story about the Vatican's secrets. It is the darkness that the imagination fills with shapes. What shapes do we choose to see? That depends on who is looking. Some of those shapes are probably mundane, administrative records that would bore anyone who tried to read them, financial documents that would embarrass the institution but reveal no cosmic truths, personnel files that protect the privacy of individuals long dead. But some of those shapes might be something else entirely. So before you settle deeper into wherever you are tonight, before you let your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift, it's natural to notice the tension here. An institution that speaks in the language of truth also speaks, sometimes, in the language of gates. Perhaps there are practical reasons. Preservation of fragile materials that would crumble if exposed to too much handling. Their paper so brittle that each touch brings them closer to destruction. Protection of private information about individuals who are still living, or whose descendants are still living. The slow, painstaking work of cataloguing documents, written in languages that only a handful of scholars in the world can still read. Scripts that take years of training to decipher. These are reasonable explanations. They account for much of what the Vatican does, but perhaps there is something else. Something older. Something that the Church collected long ago, from civilizations it absorbed and traditions it outlasted, and has never quite known what to do with. Tonight, we are not going to solve that question. We are going to sit with it. We are going to trace the edges of what is known, peer into the gaps where knowledge runs out, and see what shapes emerge from the darkness. This is not a story about proof. It is a story about silence. And silence, in an institution this old, is never entirely accidental. The Vatican Apostolic Archive was not always called by that name. For centuries, it was known as the Vatican Secret Archive, the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum in Latin. And that single word, secret, has caused more confusion than almost any other term in the Church's long and complicated history. In Latin, the word secretum does not carry the connotations it does in modern English. It does not mean hidden or forbidden or concealed from prying eyes. It means private, personal, set apart for a particular purpose rather than open to general use. A secretary, in the original sense of the word, was someone entrusted with private matters, not someone who took notes in meetings, but someone who kept confidences. The secret archive was simply the Pope's personal collection of documents, as opposed to records held by other departments of the Church or by secular authorities who might have competing interests. But languages change. Words drift from their original meanings, accumulating new associations, like ships accumulating barnacles. And in modern ears, shaped by centuries of conspiracy theories and institutional scandal, secret sounds like concealment. It sounds like intention. It sounds like something you are not supposed to see. In 2019, Pope Francis officially changed the name to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. A small adjustment, barely noticed by the outside world. A recognition that language carries weight beyond its technical definition. That perception matters even when the underlying reality has not changed. But the change came after centuries of the old name. By the time it was made, the mythology had already taken root, spreading through books and films and whispered conversations in ways that no official renaming could undo. Because here is a truth about institutions that few people like to acknowledge. They do not need to hide things for people to believe they are hiding things. They only need to be old and large and difficult to access. The human mind, faced with opacity, will do the rest. When you cannot see inside a room, you imagine what might be there. When you cannot read a document, you imagine what it might say. When access is denied without detailed explanation, you construct explanations of your own, and those explanations tend to be more dramatic than the bureaucratic reality. Imagination, left alone in the dark, does not imagine mundane administrative records. It imagines forbidden gospels, proof of ancient civilizations, evidence that would overturn everything we thought we knew about history, about religion, about the very origins of humanity itself. So the Vatican Archive became, in popular culture, a vault, a locked room at the end of a guarded corridor, a repository of secrets that powerful forces wanted kept hidden from the masses who were not worthy of the truth. Most of that is fantasy. The reality of archival work is far less dramatic. Scholars filling out request forms in triplicate, waiting days or weeks for documents to be retrieved, squinting at faded handwriting under carefully controlled lighting, while archivists watch to ensure nothing is damaged or removed. But not all of it is fantasy, because the archive is real, the restrictions are real, and the Church's long history of deciding what the faithful were permitted to know, that is real too. The scholars who have worked in the Vatican archive describe a particular quality of attention that permeates the reading rooms. It is quiet, obviously. Archives are always quiet. But there is something more than the absence of noise. There is a sense of being observed. Not paranoid observation, not hostile surveillance, but the careful watchfulness of an institution that has learned, over centuries, that documents can be dangerous. You are never truly alone with the materials. There are always archivists nearby, their presence felt even when you are not looking directly at them. They note what you request, how long you spend with each item, whether you seem to linger on certain passages. In some archives, staff may check handling and process closely, and requests are logged as part of routine preservation. None of this is sinister. It is careful. It is the caution of an institution that has seen documents stolen, forged, misquoted, and weaponized against it. The watchfulness is protection, for the documents certainly, but also for the Church itself. But protection creates distance, and distance over time creates suspicion. If some of this feels heavy to hold, you don't have to hold it all tonight. Just let the outline remain. To understand what the Vatican might be guarding, you first have to understand what an archive of this scale actually contains. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend in human terms. About 85 kilometers of shelving is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality. Documents stacked in boxes, folders organized by century, indices written in Latin that have not been updated since scholars wore robes and wrote by candlelight. The sheer mass of paper is difficult for the mind to grasp. Consider just one category: papal correspondence. Every letter sent to or from the Pope for nearly 1,000 years. Every request from a king seeking the blessing of the Church for a war he wanted to fight. Every complaint from a bishop about conditions in his diocese. Every negotiation over territory, over taxation, over the boundaries between spiritual and secular power. Every threat from rulers who believed themselves above the Church's authority, and every response from popes who believed otherwise. Multiply that by all the cardinals, bishops, nuncios and legates who have served the Church across every continent over the centuries. The volume becomes staggering. The Vatican was, for most of European history, the most extensive diplomatic network in the world, with representatives in every court, in every kingdom, in every territory where Christians lived or might be converted. Each of those representatives generated paper, reports, assessments, observations, requests for guidance, accounts of successes and failures. And that is only the official correspondence. The archive also holds trial records from ecclesiastical courts that operated for centuries. Inquisition files documenting investigations, interrogations, and punishments. Financial ledgers tracking the wealth of an institution that was, at various points, richer than most nations. Property deeds for lands that have changed hands a dozen times since the Church first claimed them. Architectural plans for buildings that still stand, and buildings that have long since crumbled. Personal diaries of clergy who lived and died centuries ago, their private thoughts preserved while their bodies returned to dust. Most people imagine a locked room, a vault, a single forbidden door. But archives don't feel like that. They feel like systems, lists and boxes and numbers that only make sense to someone trained to read them. Tonight, imagine you are not breaking into anything. You are simply trying to find one thread inside a mountain of paper. You would start the way scholars always start, with a name, a date, a language, a subject that has changed labels across centuries. And sometimes, the real barrier isn't a locked door. It's that the thing you need is filed under a name you'd never think to ask for. Because here is the quiet power of an archive. It doesn't only store information, it decides how information is discoverable. A mislabel can make a thing effectively invisible, even when it's technically there. And sometimes, what people call a secret is just a record that became hard to reach. If a document is catalogued vaguely, you will walk past it. If it is cross-referenced carefully, it will eventually be found. If it is placed inside a series that requires special permission, it will sit in the dark for another generation. And this is why the word guarded can be misleading. Sometimes the guard is not a soldier. Sometimes the guard is a classification system. Hold one gentle thought. The strongest form of secrecy is sometimes simply being unsearchable. Somewhere in that mass of paper are documents that would rewrite our understanding of specific historical events. We know this because it has happened before. Scholars granted access to previously restricted collections have uncovered letters that changed how we understand the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Church's complex relationships with colonial powers, its negotiations with fascist governments in the 20th century. Each time, the documents were there all along. They were not created when they were discovered. They had been sitting in boxes, in folders, on shelves, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right way. They simply had not been seen. So the question is not whether the archive contains surprises. The question is, how many surprises remain unfound? Imagine a collection acquired during the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Byzantine Empire had been the eastern half of Rome, the continuation of an ancient civilization that had preserved knowledge through centuries of chaos in the West. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, scholars fled westward, carrying with them whatever they could save. Byzantine manuscripts in Greek, texts that had been copied and preserved for 1,000 years, while Western Europe struggled through what some historians call the Dark Ages. Some ended up in Italian cities, Florence, Venice, Rome. Some were purchased by wealthy patrons who recognized their value. Some were acquired by the Church, whose agents were always watching for materials that might strengthen or challenge its position. We know that fragments from this period have surfaced in Vatican collections over the centuries, translated and published by scholars who were granted access. But how many remain untranslated? How many sit in boxes that have not been opened since the 15th century, their pages slowly degrading while they wait for someone to request them? Someone who would first need to know they exist. This is the paradox of a vast archive. You cannot request what you do not know is there, and the Church has never published a complete catalogue of its holdings. Perhaps because a complete catalogue does not exist, perhaps because creating one would take decades and resources the Church is not willing to commit, or perhaps because some things are easier to protect when no one knows to ask for them. There is another paradox, quieter, but just as important. The Vatican Archive is simultaneously one of the most studied and one of the least understood collections in the world. Thousands of scholars have spent years of their lives in those reading rooms. Millions of pages have been examined, photographed, translated, analyzed, and published. And yet, the percentage of the total collection that has been thoroughly examined remains small, single digits by some estimates. The rest waits in darkness, not forbidden necessarily, but simply unvisited, uncatalogued materials that have never been described in enough detail for anyone to know what they contain. Collections acquired centuries ago and never fully processed. Boxes that were sealed when they arrived and have never been opened since. And in the boxes that remain unopened, the only honest answer is still the same: unknown. The Church does not say what waits there, perhaps because even the Church does not know. And in that uncertainty, every possibility remains alive. What possibilities do you carry with you tonight? They do not need answers, only room to breathe. There is a process for accessing the Vatican archive, and understanding that process reveals something important about how institutions think about knowledge and who should possess it. First, you must be a qualified researcher. This typically means holding an advanced degree in a relevant field with a track record of published scholarship that demonstrates you know how to handle historical materials responsibly. You must be affiliated with a recognized institution, a university, a research institute, an organization that can vouch for your credentials and your intentions. Second, you must apply for a tessera, an access card, which requires a letter of introduction from your institution and approval from the archive's prefect. This approval is not automatic. It is granted based on an assessment of your research project, your qualifications, and factors that are not always made explicit. Third, you must specify exactly which documents you wish to examine. You cannot browse. You cannot wander the shelves looking for interesting materials. You submit requests, identifying specific items by their archival classifications, and archivists retrieve those materials and bring them to a supervised reading room. Fourth, even with all approvals in place, some collections remain closed. The most common restriction is the 75-year rule. Documents involving living persons, or persons who might reasonably still be living, are sealed for 75 years from their creation. This is not unique to the Vatican. Many state archives and private collections have similar policies, designed to protect privacy and prevent the misuse of sensitive personal information. But the Vatican also maintains restrictions that have nothing to do with the 75-year rule. Collections that are closed for preservation reasons, their materials too fragile to risk repeated handling. Collections that are closed because they have not been catalogued, their contents unknown even to the archivists who guard them. Collections that are closed for reasons described only as internal policy, without further explanation. No scandal is required to explain these restrictions. Bureaucracy alone can account for much of it. Large institutions move slowly. Priorities compete for limited resources. The work of cataloguing and preservation is unglamorous and underfunded everywhere in the world. But bureaucracy and secrecy look identical from the outside, and the Church has not always been eager to explain the difference. And now, with that thought, we follow the trail backward, past Latin, past early Christianity, toward the first civilizations that learned to turn memory into something physical. Long before Rome was founded, before the first stones of the temple in Jerusalem were laid, before the pyramids rose from the Egyptian sand, there was Sumer. In the fertile valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the land we now call Iraq, a civilization arose that would shape everything that came after. The Sumerians appeared around 4500 BCE, seemingly emerging from the mists of prehistory, with technologies and knowledge systems that scholars still struggle to explain. The Sumerians invented writing, not just a writing system, but the very concept of recording language in permanent form. Before Sumer, humanity lived in a world of oral tradition, where knowledge could travel only as far as a human voice could carry, and could survive only as long as memory persisted. After Sumer, thoughts could be frozen in clay, preserved for millennia, transmitted across distances and generations. They developed mathematics that we still use today, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, the base 60 number system that persists in how we measure time and angles. All of this comes from Sumer. They built cities with sophisticated irrigation systems, channeling the rivers to create agricultural abundance in lands that would otherwise be desert. They developed legal codes that established principles still echoed in modern jurisprudence. And they told stories. Stories of creation, stories of floods, stories of beings who came from elsewhere and gave humanity the tools of civilization. These were not children's tales told around fires, though they may have begun that way. These were official records, inscribed by trained scribes in the service of kings and temples. They were copied and recopied across generations, preserved in libraries that were the pride of empires. They were considered important enough to carve into stone and bake into clay, media designed to survive the ages. And they did survive. That is the remarkable thing. While everything else from Sumer crumbled, the cities, the canals, the temples, the people themselves, the tablets endured. Buried under sand and debris, forgotten for millennia, they waited for someone to find them. When they were found, they spoke. These stories were carved into clay tablets, pressed into wet earth with wedge-shaped tools, then baked hard in the Mesopotamian sun until they became nearly indestructible. When the cities fell, conquered, abandoned, swallowed by sand, the tablets remained. For thousands of years, they lay buried beneath the ruins, waiting. Then, in the 19th century, European archaeologists began to dig. What they found would trouble the church for generations. Not because the tablets contradicted Christianity directly. The Sumerians had never heard of Christ, had lived and died thousands of years before Bethlehem, but because they told stories that sounded familiar, too familiar. Stories that the church had taught were unique revelations from the one true God, now appearing in texts written by pagans who worshipped a pantheon of squabbling deities. The implications were uncomfortable, and they remain uncomfortable today. Imagine a scribe at work, not a monk, not a priest, a clerk, a person whose job is not faith, but record. The clay is cool in the hand. The reed stylus makes a soft, dry sound as it cuts the surface. And the words being written are not poetic, they are practical. How many sacks of grain moved from one storehouse to another? Which family owes what? Which worker was paid, and which was not? And yet, this is how it begins. Because when a society learns to record the ordinary, it eventually records the extraordinary. A king's victories, a treaty, a flood, a strange light in the sky that frightened the city for 3 nights, not because it wants to entertain future generations, but because it is trying to keep itself stable. And that matters tonight, because when people say, documents older than Christianity, they often imagine a single dramatic manuscript with a forbidden title. But older can mean something subtler. It can mean later copies of very old traditions. It can mean a medieval manuscript that preserves a story first told 2,000 years earlier. It can mean a Latin translation of a Greek text that was itself a translation of something older still. So if we're being calm and honest, the Vatican does not need to possess a 5,000-year-old clay tablet for the phrase, older than Christianity, to be emotionally true. It only needs to preserve a chain of copying, of translation, of libraries rescuing fragments from the fire, from the sea, from the collapse of empires. And if a story survives only through copying, something changes each time a hand repeats it. What we call original may simply be the version that won. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature in the world, contains a flood narrative that predates the story of Noah by at least 1,000 years. The details are strikingly similar, close enough to feel unsettling. A man warned by a god that the divine council has decided to destroy humanity. A boat built to specific dimensions according to divine instructions. Animals gathered 2 by 2. A deluge that covers the earth, erasing everything that walks or crawls. A bird sent out to find dry land, returning when it finds none. Eventually, the waters recede. The boat comes to rest on a mountain, and the survivor makes offerings to the gods who spared him. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Either the Hebrew scribes who composed Genesis had borrowed from an older Mesopotamian tradition, or both traditions were drawing on something older still, some shared memory of an actual catastrophe that had been passed down through countless generations before anyone thought to write it down. If both traditions preserved something real, then preservation itself becomes the deeper theme, and the where becomes a long, quiet chain. The Church's initial response was dismissal. The similarities were coincidence, scholars were told, or they were hostile imitations, false versions of the true story, planted by darker forces to confuse the faithful. Or they were corrupted memories of the original revelation, distorted by pagan peoples who had lost touch with the one true God. But as more tablets were translated, as the scope of Sumerian literature became clear, the dismissals grew harder to sustain. Here was a civilization that had written about creation, about the nature of humanity, about the relationship between mortals and divine beings. And it had done so centuries before Abraham left Ur, before Moses received the commandments, before any of the events described in the Hebrew Bible supposedly took place. Now picture the journey of knowledge itself. A story begins in the ancient Near East, then travels by trade routes, then lives inside another language, then gets copied by a tired hand in candlelight, then survives because one community thought it was worth keeping, then crosses borders again, and eventually sits in a European collection as a manuscript in Syriac or a fragment in Greek. What gets kept is not always what is true. Sometimes what gets kept is what is useful, or what is beautiful, or what a particular institution believes it can control. And that is why the Vatican becomes relevant, not as a magical owner of secrets, but as a collector of continuity. Because once Rome becomes a center of scholarship and power, it becomes a place where texts converge, and convergence creates an illusion. When enough fragments gather in one place, people begin to believe that place contains the whole story. So let's hold the sleep-soft thought. What if the Vatican's older documents are not a single revelation, but 1,000 small survivals? A hymn rewritten into a prayer, a myth copied into a commentary, a pagan name preserved in the margin because a scribe didn't know whether to erase it. And what if the most unsettling material is not the famous stuff, but the intermediate stuff, the notes between the lines, the alternate versions, the letters between scholars arguing over which words should remain? Because the moment a text exists in two versions, someone has to decide which version becomes official, and decisions like that can echo for centuries. The Sumerians called their gods the Anunnaki. The name has been translated in various ways: those of royal blood, those who from heaven came, those who descended from the sky to earth. The Anunnaki were not distant, abstract deities dwelling in a realm beyond human comprehension. In Sumerian texts, they walk among humans. They build cities. They establish laws. They argue with each other, scheme against each other, form factions and alliances. They love and hate, create and destroy, experience regret and satisfaction. In one tablet, the gods grow tired of the labor required to maintain the world. Digging canals, tending fields, building infrastructure. The work is endless, and the gods, apparently, do not enjoy it. So they decide to create a new being to do the work for them. They take clay, mix it with the blood of a slain deity, and fashion humanity. Humans are created as servants, workers, beings designed to labor so that the gods might rest. But humanity multiplies beyond expectation. The noise of human cities, the clamor of human activity, disturbs the gods' rest. Sleep becomes impossible, and so a faction among the Anunnaki decides to send a flood, to wipe the earth clean of the troublesome creatures they had made. One god dissents. He warns a faithful man. He provides instructions for survival. And so, humanity persists, through divine intervention that circumvents divine destruction. The parallels to Genesis are obvious, too obvious to be comfortable. Here is the thought that sleep allows us to hold gently, without needing to resolve it. Older can mean several things at once. One interpretation is that the older story is the true one, and the newer story is a copy. But that assumes age equals authenticity, which is not necessarily true. Another interpretation is that both traditions preserve a shared memory of real events, and this has the virtue of not requiring us to choose between traditions. A third interpretation is that humans, across cultures and centuries, reach for similar narrative patterns to explain their existence. And this suggests that the parallels tell us more about human psychology than about historical events. All of these interpretations have their defenders. None of them has been definitively proven. And so the question remains open. The tablets remain fragmentary, the archive remains sealed, and we remain uncertain, as humans have always been uncertain, about where we come from and what our stories really mean. Now, the scholarly consensus is clear and has been for over a century. The Hebrew flood narrative was influenced by Mesopotamian traditions. This is not controversial in academic circles. The question is only how direct the influence was, and what it means for how we understand the composition of the biblical texts. But there is another thought, one that scholars rarely voice aloud, at least in the presence of church officials. The Vatican, inevitably, had to decide how to place this information inside its own story. The cuneiform tablets that revolutionized our understanding of ancient religion were discovered in the 1840s and 1850s. The first major translations appeared in the 1870s. By the late 19th century, these translations were widely discussed in educated circles, and it became clear that the Bible contained stories older than the Bible itself. The Vatican would certainly have paid attention. It had every reason to. But what does attention produce? Sometimes action, sometimes silence, sometimes both. And the Vatican had resources that secular institutions did not. Missionaries stationed in every corner of the world, from the deserts of Mesopotamia to the jungles of South America. A network of monasteries, schools, and churches that had been collecting texts for 1,000 years. And an interest, a deep, abiding institutional interest, in controlling the narrative about Christian origins. So the thought arises and refuses to go away. Whether the Vatican acquired Mesopotamian materials during this period is still unclear in any complete way. Did missionaries, scholars, or agents of the Church obtain tablets, translations, or documents that shed light on the relationship between Sumerian religion and the Hebrew Scriptures? The answer remains partial. What would a complete answer even look like? Perhaps something quieter than we expect. We do not have a complete answer. What we have are fragments, references in old catalogues to materials from the Oriental missions, collections described as containing pre-Christian religious texts without further specification, gaps in the public record that might be explained by mundane bureaucracy or might be explained by deliberate silence. So tonight, when we speak of Sumer, don't imagine a direct pipeline from ancient clay to Vatican shelf. Imagine something quieter. A civilization invents writing. Its stories spread. Empires rise and fall. Languages change. Libraries burn. Monasteries copy. Scholars translate. And eventually, centuries later, the Vatican ends up holding pieces of the human record that are older than the religion the Vatican represents. Not because it planned it that way, because history is a river, and Rome is one of the places the river deposits what it carries. And now, we move to the most famous burning library of all, the one people speak about as if it contained everything. There is another story that haunts the edges of this inquiry, a story of loss so profound that we can barely comprehend what was taken from us. The story of the Library of Alexandria. Founded in the 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, the library was the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge. Scholars estimate it held between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls. The enormous variation in that estimate tells you how little we actually know about what has been lost. The library was more than a collection of books. It was a research institution, a gathering place for the greatest minds of the Mediterranean world. Scholars came from Greece, from Persia, from India, from every civilization that traded with Egypt. They brought their knowledge with them, and they left copies behind. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, poetry, engineering. Every field of human inquiry was represented in those halls. The Ptolemaic rulers understood the power of knowledge. They sent agents throughout the known world to acquire texts, sometimes paying handsomely, sometimes simply confiscating materials from ships that stopped in Alexandria's harbour. Every book that entered Egypt was supposed to be copied, with the copy returned to its owner while the original remained in the library. For 3 centuries, the collection grew. It became a symbol of human achievement, a monument to the belief that knowledge could be gathered, preserved, and transmitted across generations. And then it was lost. But here is what most people do not understand about the loss. It was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow erosion, a gradual forgetting, a death by 1,000 cuts spread across centuries. There are many villains in the story, depending on who tells it. Julius Caesar, whose troops may have accidentally burned part of the collection during a siege. Christian mobs, who attacked the temple complex where the library was housed. Arab conquerors, who supposedly used the scrolls as fuel for bathhouses, though this story is likely apocryphal, invented centuries later by those with political axes to grind. The truth is messier and sadder. The library declined because empires declined, because funding dried up, because the scholars who understood its value died and were not replaced, because the political will to maintain such an institution evaporated in the face of more immediate concerns. Knowledge does not need to be deliberately destroyed. It can simply be neglected until it crumbles. What crumbles first? The paper or the attention that keeps it alive? Tonight, let's slow down and treat Alexandria gently, because the way people talk about the Library of Alexandria is almost like a bedtime myth. A perfect building, a perfect collection, a single catastrophic fire. But reality is softer and messier. Knowledge doesn't disappear in one moment. It leaks away. It fragments. It migrates. When a library fades slowly, the first losses can be quiet and almost unrecorded. The famous works are mourned. The minor fragments disappear without ceremony. And that leaves one soft question hanging in the air. What vanished before anyone thought to count it? A scroll gets copied once, but not twice. A text survives in one city, but not the next. A scholar quotes a paragraph, and that quote becomes the only thing that remains. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria is one of history's great tragedies, but it was not a single event. There was no moment when a torch was touched to scrolls and everything went up in flames. The library declined over centuries, damaged by wars and civil conflicts, neglected by shifting imperial priorities, its contents scattered or destroyed in waves. By the time the Roman Empire officially adopted Christianity in the 4th century, the library was already diminished. But it was not gone. Scholars still worked there. Texts still circulated. Knowledge still survived, if in reduced form. That knowledge did not vanish all at once. It migrated, as knowledge does, from one set of hands to another. This is where the story becomes relevant to our inquiry tonight. Some was lost forever. We know this because later writers reference works that no longer exist, books they had read or heard of, treatises they quoted, ideas they attributed to philosophers whose writings have completely vanished. The gaps in our knowledge of the ancient world are immense, and the library's gradual destruction is a primary cause. But some survived. Copied by monks in Byzantine monasteries, men who may not have understood what they were preserving, but preserved it anyway. Translated by Islamic scholars who recognized the value of Greek learning and rendered it into Arabic, saving it for future generations. Smuggled across borders by refugees fleeing successive waves of conquest, carried in saddlebags and hidden in the holds of ships. And some, according to certain accounts, ended up in Rome. And this matters for the Vatican, because the Vatican's role in the story is not, we kept the whole library. The Vatican's role is more like this. When the ancient world breaks into pieces, institutions that can endure become lifeboats. Not perfect lifeboats, not pure lifeboats, but lifeboats. They keep what they can keep. They copy what they think matters. They preserve what fits inside their worldview, and sometimes, accidentally, they preserve what does not. Now picture a scholar centuries later, in a quieter era, opening a text and realizing, this is an older voice speaking through a newer hand. That feeling is powerful. It creates obsession, because you start hunting for the earlier layer. You start asking. You start tracing backward toward whatever came before, toward the earlier layer beneath the later one. And that is how forbidden archives are born, not only by hiding things, but by creating a culture where older material is treated like a treasure, and treasure attracts fear, control, and legend. The Vatican Library is not the same institution as the Vatican Archive, though they are related and sometimes confused. The library holds published works, books, manuscripts, printed texts. The archive holds administrative records, correspondence, legal documents, institutional papers. But the distinction blurs when you go back far enough in time. Before the printing press, before the modern concept of publication existed, everything was manuscript. Everything was unique. The Vatican Library openly acknowledges that it holds materials from the ancient world. Greek and Latin texts, copied during the medieval period. Fragments of works that survive nowhere else on earth. The Vatican is, in some respects, one of the last living connections to the classical tradition that the Library of Alexandria represented. But the question of what else it might hold, what texts were acquired during the chaos of late antiquity, what scrolls were carried to Rome as the ancient world collapsed around them, that question remains unanswered. After Alexandria fades, the center of copying and preserving shifts again and again. Sometimes it moves into monasteries, where texts survive through ritual repetition. Sometimes it moves into the hands of translators, where ideas survive by changing form. Sometimes it moves into royal courts, where knowledge becomes power. And Rome, with its long institutional memory, becomes a place where these strands eventually gather. So when we say the Vatican guards documents older than Christianity, the more accurate, sleep-honest version is, the Vatican sits at a crossroads where older streams of thought were absorbed, relabeled, and sometimes carefully stored. And if you want one image to hold in your mind tonight, let it be this. The Vatican is not a single chest of secrets. It is more like a coastline where the sea has been throwing driftwood for centuries. And among the driftwood are pieces from ships that sank long before the church existed. Consider what this means in practical terms. A text written in ancient Babylon gets copied by a Persian scribe. The Persian copy survives the fall of Persia and is translated into Greek. The Greek translation is preserved in Alexandria until the library declines. A fragment survives in a Byzantine monastery, where it is copied again, now into Latin. The Latin copy travels to Rome during the Renaissance, where it is acquired by a cardinal whose collection eventually passes to the Vatican. At each stage, something is lost. The original language, the original context, the marginal notes that explained obscure references. But something is also preserved. The core narrative, the essential ideas, the echo of a voice that spoke 4,000 years ago. And now that echo sits in a climate-controlled room beneath Vatican City, classified under a system that a Babylonian scribe could never have imagined, waiting for a scholar who speaks a language that did not exist when the original words were first committed to clay. This is how knowledge survives, not through grand preservation projects, but through chains of accidents. Imagine being a scholar in Alexandria in the 5th century. The old gods are outlawed, the temples are being closed or converted to churches. The philosophical schools that have operated for 800 years, teaching traditions that stretch back to Plato and beyond, are under pressure to conform to Christian doctrine or face dissolution. You have access to texts that will not survive the transition. Works of philosophy that the Church considers heretical, scientific treatises that contradict the literal interpretation of Scripture, historical accounts that present events differently than the emerging Christian narrative requires. The choices were few, and all of them carried risk. If you are like many scholars of that era, you hide what you can. You make copies and distribute them to colleagues you trust. You send texts to friends in other cities, hoping they will find safer homes. You translate Greek into Syriac or Coptic, languages that the Roman authorities do not monitor as closely. And some of those texts, through routes we can only partially reconstruct, made their way into collections that the Church would eventually control. This is not speculation built on nothing. We have evidence. The Vatican Library contains works that were condemned as heretical in the ancient world: Gnostic texts, Neoplatonic philosophy, fragments of traditions that the Church officially rejected. They survived because someone preserved them, and that someone was often a monk or a cleric who recognized their value even while disagreeing with their content. And through that same contradiction, more than we expect can survive. What survives longest? Often, the things no one thought to destroy. So the Church became, paradoxically, the guardian of knowledge it had tried to suppress, the destroyer and the preserver, bound together in an institution that has outlasted every empire that ever tried to control it. How does an institution hold both roles at once? Carefully, quietly, and with many things left unsaid. An institution can carry both roles at once, carefully, slowly, and with many silences still in place. Now, the uncomfortable part. When driftwood arrives, someone decides what to build from it. Some pieces become part of official theology. Some become curiosities. Some become dangerous. Some become useful for understanding heresies, which is another way of saying useful for controlling them. And so a pattern emerges. When an institution inherits fragments of older knowledge, it chooses where they belong, openly, narrowly, or quietly out of reach. The options are familiar. Preserve them openly, keep them for scholars only, bury them in Latin footnotes, lock them behind permissions and waiting lists. And the tension increases when the fragments touch the deepest nerves of belief, the creation stories, the flood stories, the origin of authority, the claim that one tradition is the first and the truest. Tonight, we're not here to prove anything wild. We're here to follow a pattern. When older stories sit beneath newer ones, institutions become protective, not because they're evil, because the human mind does not like foundation stones to move. So now, with Alexandria behind us, we step into the world where fragments become arguments, where a text becomes a weapon, and where the Vatican begins to look less like a library and more like a gate. Let us return to the parallels, because they deserve closer examination than we have given them so far. The book of Genesis tells us that God created the heavens and the earth, that he formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed life into him, that he planted a garden in the east, a place called Eden, and placed the man there to tend it, that he created woman from the man's rib, a companion and a partner, that a serpent, more cunning than any other creature, tempted them to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge, that they ate, and their eyes were opened, and they were cast out of the garden, and cherubim with flaming swords were set to guard the way back. These are foundational narratives for Western civilization. They have shaped how billions of people understand the origins of humanity, the nature of good and evil, the relationship between humans and the divine. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, tells us that the gods created humanity from the blood of a slain deity, mixed with clay from the earth, that humans were made to serve the gods, to do the work that the gods themselves no longer wished to perform, that the first humans lived in a divine garden, blessed and protected, until they failed to satisfy their creators. The Epic of Atrahasis tells us that the gods grew tired of human noise, human multiplication, human presence on the earth, that they sent plagues to reduce the population, but humanity recovered, that they sent droughts, but humanity survived, that finally, in desperation, they decided to send a flood that would wipe the earth clean, that one man was warned and built a boat and survived with his family and representatives of the animals and repopulated the world after the waters receded. These are not vague thematic similarities that might be dismissed as universal human concerns. These are structural parallels. Creation from earth and divine substance, a garden of origins, a fall from favor, a catastrophic flood, a single surviving family. The specificity is what makes them troubling. It is one thing to say that many cultures have flood stories. They do. And some scholars attribute this to the universal human experience of catastrophic flooding in river valleys and coastal areas. It is another thing entirely to find flood stories with the same narrative beats, the same details, the same sequence of events, appearing in cultures separated by geography, but connected by trade routes and migration patterns. The parallels suggest transmission. They suggest that stories traveled, were adopted, were adapted. They suggest that what we think of as original may have been a retelling. This does not mean the stories are false. A truth can be told in many ways. A real event can be remembered differently by different peoples. But it does raise questions about what revelation means, and those questions have never been fully answered. The tablets containing these Mesopotamian narratives were written at least 1,000 years before the earliest estimated date for the composition of Genesis. The Israelites, during the formative period of their religious tradition, were a small tribal people living in lands dominated by Mesopotamian cultural influence. Their scribes would have known these stories. Their priests would have heard them. The traders and diplomats and soldiers who moved between cultures would have carried them. So the question is not whether there was influence. The scholarly consensus on this point is essentially unanimous. The question is what the influence means. One interpretation is that Genesis represents a Hebrew retelling of Mesopotamian myths, adapted to fit a monotheistic theology. The many gods of Babylon become the one God of Israel. The capricious and often selfish deities of Sumerian tradition become a purposeful creator with a plan for humanity. The arbitrary destruction of the flood becomes moral judgment against human wickedness. This interpretation does not require any supernatural explanation. It simply requires that stories travel across cultures and change as they travel, adapting to the beliefs and values of each new people who adopts them. Another interpretation is that both traditions preserve echoes of actual events. A real flood, perhaps. There is geological evidence for catastrophic flooding in the ancient Near East. events that would have seemed apocalyptic to the people who survived them. A real cultural memory, passed down through generations before anyone thought to write it down, taking different forms in different tellings, but preserving a core of shared experience. A third interpretation, favored by many traditional believers, is that God revealed the truth to multiple peoples in multiple ways, and that the Mesopotamian versions are distorted shadows of the original revelation, preserved more faithfully in Genesis. This interpretation requires faith in divine communication, but it has the virtue of acknowledging the parallels rather than denying them. The Church has never officially endorsed any of these interpretations. It has allowed scholars to debate, encouraged caution in public statements, and maintained that the essential truth of Genesis, that God created humanity with purpose and dignity, is not undermined by literary parallels with older traditions. But it has also not opened its archives to the question of what other parallel texts might exist. And this is where the Vatican becomes relevant to our inquiry tonight. Because the Church, throughout its history, has been deeply interested in alternative creation narratives, not to promote them, but to understand them, to counter them, to explain why they were wrong, or corrupted, or incomplete. The study of heresy requires the texts of heretics. The refutation of pagan beliefs requires knowledge of what those beliefs actually were. The Church has always maintained that you cannot fight an enemy you do not understand. So the Church studied, it collected, it preserved, and somewhere in that preservation, lines may have blurred. Materials gathered to be refuted may have simply been stored. Texts acquired for study may have been filed and forgotten. The boundary between dangerous knowledge we must understand and dangerous knowledge we must suppress is not always clear, and institutions do not always maintain consistent policies across centuries. How many texts crossed that blurry line and never crossed back? How many texts crossed that blurry line and never crossed back? There are specific documents that scholars have long wished to examine. The records of the early church councils, where decisions were made about which texts would be included in the Bible and which would be excluded. These were not unanimous decisions. They were debated, sometimes bitterly. Votes were taken. Some books that had been read as scripture for centuries were rejected. The councils that made these decisions kept records. Where are those records now? The correspondence between church officials and secular authorities during the periods of textual consolidation. When the Emperor Constantine ordered 50 copies of the Bible to be produced for the churches of Constantinople, who decided what those copies would contain? What debates preceded the decision? What alternatives were considered? The inventories of monastic libraries during the medieval period. Monasteries were the primary preservers of texts during the centuries after Rome fell. They copied, translated, and stored documents from across the known world. When monasteries were dissolved, reformed, or absorbed into other institutions, their libraries often passed to the Vatican. What was in those libraries? These are not sensational questions. They do not require hidden chambers or forbidden knowledge. They require only access to administrative records that the Vatican certainly possesses, but has not made fully available to independent scholars. And so, the wait continues, and the mythology grows, and the gap between what is known and what is imagined continues to widen with each passing year. What fills that gap? Our hopes, our fears, our unfinished questions. The Catholic Church did not conquer the ancient world, it outlasted it. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, fragmenting into barbarian kingdoms that rose and fell with dizzying speed, the Church remained. When the Great Plagues swept across Europe, killing a third of the population in some regions, the Church remained. When wars devastated entire territories, when famines emptied the countryside, when entire peoples migrated across continents, fleeing violence or seeking opportunity, the Church remained. This persistence was not accidental, it was structural. The Church had something that secular powers lacked, an organizational framework that transcended any single leader, any single territory, any single generation. Emperors died, the papacy continued. Kingdoms fell, the dioceses remained. The Church thought in centuries, while everyone else thought in lifetimes. And throughout all of this, the Church collected. It collected tithes and taxes, building wealth that rivaled and sometimes exceeded that of kings. It collected land and property, accumulating estates across Europe that would not be fully surrendered until the modern era. It collected political influence and diplomatic connections, inserting itself into every significant negotiation between powers. But it also collected something less tangible and more enduring. It collected knowledge. Every monastery had a scriptorium, a room where monks spent their days copying texts by hand. Every cathedral had a library, however modest. Every diocese maintained archives of its own local records: births, deaths, marriages, disputes, donations, judgments. And above all of these, receiving reports and materials from across Christendom, sat the Vatican, the central repository, the institutional memory of an organization that spanned continents and centuries. This collection was not random, it was strategic. The Church understood, long before modern corporations or governments, that information is power. To know what is happening in distant territories gives you the ability to respond. To possess documents gives you the ability to prove claims, settle disputes, establish precedents. To control the flow of knowledge gives you the ability to shape how people understand the world. So the Vatican collected not just for curiosity, but for capacity. It built an information infrastructure that would serve the institution for centuries. And in building that infrastructure, it inevitably gathered materials that had nothing to do with its spiritual mission. Documents that were acquired along with other documents. Texts that came attached to collections the Church wanted. Materials that arrived in boxes that were never fully sorted. The archive became a magnet for the written word, drawing in paper from every direction, storing it, forgetting it, and leaving it for future generations to rediscover. How much was gathered simply because it arrived? How much was stored without anyone asking what it meant? How much was gathered simply because it was there, without anyone asking what it meant? When missionaries traveled to distant lands, they brought back more than converts. They brought objects, texts, and detailed accounts of what they had seen. When church diplomats negotiated with foreign powers, they gathered intelligence along with treaties. When religious orders were suppressed, as happened periodically throughout church history, when orders grew too powerful or too controversial, their records and libraries often ended up in Vatican collections. This was not a conspiracy. It was simply how the institution functioned. The Church was, for most of European history, the most literate, most organized, and most persistent institution on the continent. Of course, it accumulated documents. That was what it did. But accumulation creates its own problems. When you have too much, you cannot process it all. When collections grow faster than cataloging capacity, things get lost. Not destroyed, not deliberately hidden, simply misplaced in the vastness, filed in the wrong location, stored without adequate description, forgotten. The Vatican has acknowledged, on multiple occasions, that significant portions of its archive remain uncatalogued. Materials acquired centuries ago that have never been fully processed. Collections donated by private individuals without detailed inventories. Documents stored in locations that were later reorganized, their original context lost in the shuffle. This is not sinister, it is human. Every large archive in the world faces similar challenges, but it means that no one, not even the Vatican itself, can say with complete certainty what the archive contains. Tonight, let's make this concrete. Imagine a person leaving Europe with a mission. They carry scripture, they carry letters of authority, they carry a sense of purpose. But they also carry a notebook. And when they arrive somewhere unfamiliar, they begin doing what humans always do, translating a new world into familiar categories, beliefs, stories, fears, honors, and the names they give the sky. And then they write it down, sometimes respectfully, sometimes arrogantly, sometimes with genuine fascination, sometimes with the coldness of someone who thinks they are recording errors. But regardless of motive, a record is created. Now here is where the Vatican becomes a strange gravitational center, because when reports return, they don't only go to families, they go to institutions, orders, congregations, networks of administration that need information. And the information isn't always spiritual. It's logistical. Which roads are safe? Which rulers are hostile? Which ports allow entry? Which languages are spoken where? Which words create trust? Which rituals matter most? And so missionary archives often contain things that feel unexpectedly modern. Ethnographic observations, sketches, maps, descriptions of ceremonies, lists of local terms, attempts to build dictionaries. Not because the Vatican planned a grand anthropological project, but because empires and missions run on knowledge. And knowledge, once written, becomes evidence. If you were the Vatican, you wouldn't need to do anything dramatic. You would file them, not as revelations, as records. And then, in time, the records would become a kind of quiet power. Consider the Jesuits, to take just one example among many. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540, became one of the most influential religious orders in history. Jesuit missionaries traveled to China, Japan, India, the Americas, Africa, and virtually every other region where the Church sought to expand. They were famous for their learning, their adaptability, and their meticulous record-keeping. Jesuit archives contain materials found nowhere else in the world. Observations of cultures that no longer exist in their original form. Records of languages that are now extinct. Maps of regions that had never been mapped by Europeans before. Scientific observations that preceded their formal discovery by mainstream European science by decades or even centuries. When the Society of Jesus was suppressed by Pope Clement XIV in 1773, a political decision driven by pressure from secular monarchs who feared Jesuit influence, its archives were scattered across the globe. Some materials remained with former members who hid them. Some were seized by secular authorities in various countries. Some ended up in the Vatican. The suppression lasted until 1814, when the order was restored. But those 41 years created chaos in the archival record that has never been fully resolved. Documents were lost, hidden, or absorbed into other collections without clear provenance. What Jesuit materials might rest in Vatican collections today, uncatalogued, unexamined, unknown. Scholars who have been granted access to some Jesuit materials have noted gaps, references to other documents that could not be located, indices that promised materials not present in the collections made available. The sense, difficult to prove but hard to shake, that they were seeing only part of the picture. And the Jesuits are just one example. The Vatican also absorbed materials from the Knights Templar after their dissolution in the 14th century. What did the Templars know? What did they record? The legends are extravagant, hidden treasures, secret rituals, forbidden knowledge acquired in the Holy Land. The reality was probably more mundane. Financial records, property deeds, correspondence. But even mundane Templar materials might shed light on aspects of medieval history that remain poorly understood. The Vatican absorbed materials from monasteries dissolved during the Reformation. Some of those monasteries had preserved texts for centuries, copying and recopying manuscripts that dated back to the classical era. When the monasteries closed, their libraries scattered. Some texts were destroyed, some were sold, some ended up in Rome. The Vatican absorbed materials from noble families whose lines ended without heirs, from bishops whose personal collections passed to the church upon their deaths, from scholars who bequeathed their papers to an institution they trusted to preserve them. Each absorption added to the mass, each addition complicated the picture, and each uncatalogued collection became a vessel for the unknown. Some stories traveled inside those collections, and some of them may still be waiting, not hidden, just unopened. So when people say colonial materials, they often imagine propaganda. But archives are rarely only one thing. They are messy. A letter might contain a report about conversion, and then casually a description of a local creation story that sounds eerily similar to an ancient myth, and then a complaint about weather, and then a list of supplies. And in that mess are patterns. Sometimes those patterns are the kind that make conspiracy-minded people excited. Look, they say, here is a tradition that sounds like a flood story. Here is a legend about beings who came from the sky. Here is a map that doesn't match what we were taught. Tonight, we don't need to jump to conclusions. We only need to acknowledge the mechanism. When an institution gathers global reports for centuries, it becomes a warehouse of human stories. And some of those stories will be older than Christianity, in the sense that they preserve pre-Christian cosmologies, ancestral histories, and local mythic timelines that stretch far beyond the church. Consider the ethical tension, because a lot of this material was gathered under unequal power. Some was taken, some was traded, some was copied without consent, some was preserved in a way that removed it from the people it belonged to. So a modern scholar reading those files feels two things at once: fascination and discomfort. And discomfort is a form of silence too, because even when archives open, not everyone is eager to confront what the documents reveal about history. So let's put a calmer question into the dark. What if some of the Vatican's most sensitive colonial records are not sensitive because they prove something extraordinary, but because they reveal how knowledge was extracted, reframed, and used? Perhaps the forbidden part is moral, not supernatural. And then there's another layer: languages. Many missionary projects required learning local languages to communicate. That produced grammars and dictionaries are more powerful than they seem. Recording another culture's myths is never neutral. Translation forces equivalences: God, soul, sin, even when the worldview doesn't fit cleanly. Meaning leaks in the gaps, quietly, like water through stone. So somewhere in the archives, there are likely documents that show the moment a worldview was bent to fit another. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle way, in a footnote, in a glossary. And if you are looking for how institutions guard the past, sometimes the guarding happens right there, in how the past is redescribed. So tonight, when we speak about colonial materials, don't imagine only stolen gold or forbidden idols. Imagine paperwork that contains an entire planet's worth of stories, filtered through the pen of the person writing, and then filed, and then forgotten. And if your mind drifts here, that's perfectly fine. This story doesn't require effort, and then, sometimes, rediscovered. Which brings us to the quiet thought that keeps returning. When something is rediscovered, meaning is decided by scholars, by institutions, by whoever has the patience and permission to speak first. There is a difference between hiding something and simply not showing it. The distinction matters more than most people realize. When an institution actively hides something, there is intent. There is awareness of the thing being hidden and a conscious decision to conceal it. This requires effort, coordination, and ongoing commitment. Secrets of this kind are difficult to maintain over time because they require continuous action to preserve. But when an institution simply does not show something, the mechanics are entirely different. No decision is required. No conspiracy is necessary. No ongoing effort must be sustained. The default state of any document, in any archive, anywhere in the world, is invisibility. Only when someone actively chooses to make it available, to catalogue it, to grant access, to publicize its existence, does it become visible to the outside world. The Vatican operates in this second mode far more often than the first. It does not need to hide documents in the sense of locking them away and standing guard. It only needs to not prioritize their release. It only needs to allocate its limited resources to other tasks. It only needs to continue operating as large bureaucratic institutions have always operated, slowly and cautiously, following established procedures rather than innovating. Consider the workflow of any large archive. Materials arrive faster than they can be processed. Each item must be examined by someone qualified to understand what it is. It must be described in language that will allow future researchers to find it. It must be catalogued according to systems that may have been established centuries ago. It must be stored appropriately, in conditions that will preserve it for future generations. All of this requires trained staff, physical resources, and time. Always time, the scarcest resource of all. When resources are limited, as they always are, choices must be made. Which collections get processed first? Which documents receive detailed descriptions and which get only cursory mentions? Which materials are preserved with full climate control and which are simply stored in whatever space is available? These choices are not made by shadowy councils meeting in secret chambers. They are made by archivists, administrators, and budget committees. They are made based on perceived importance, on scholarly demand, on institutional priorities that may have been established decades ago and never reconsidered. And institutional priorities, in an organization like the Vatican, are shaped by considerations that have nothing to do with forbidden knowledge. They are shaped by current theological debates, by political relationships with governments, by the interests of senior clergy, by the simple inertia of doing things the way they have always been done. The result is a kind of passive silence, documents that no one has decided to suppress, but that no one has decided to reveal. Collections that are not secret exactly, but that are not accessible either. Materials that exist in a grey zone between hidden and available, technically present in the archive, practically invisible to the outside world. This passive silence is far more common than active concealment, and far harder to address. You cannot demand transparency for something when you do not know it exists. You cannot protest the suppression of a document when it has not been suppressed, only neglected. You cannot fight bureaucratic indifference with the same tools you would use against deliberate malice. What do you do with a silence that isn't trying to keep anything from you? You wait, or you forget, or you fill it with stories. And this is the mechanism that most people miss when they think about hidden knowledge. This is why passive silence is so difficult to confront. It isn't a battle, it's a drift. The fantasy is a locked vault, a conspiracy of silence, powerful figures meeting in shadowy rooms to decide what the world will never be allowed to know. The reality is usually simpler and sadder. It is an understaffed archive with more material than it can process. It is a cataloguing system that was designed centuries ago and never fully updated. It is a scholar who requests a document and is told, "We cannot locate it at this time." Not because anyone is hiding it, but because no one knows exactly where it is. The effect is the same. The document remains invisible. The knowledge remains inaccessible. But the cause is not malice. It is the accumulated weight of institutional inertia pressing down on an archive that has grown beyond anyone's ability to fully comprehend. In an archive, delay is a form of power. And here's the part most people miss. A secret doesn't need to be hidden forever. It only needs to be hidden long enough for the people involved to die, long enough for political pressure to fade, long enough for anger to cool into history. That is why the archive can feel forbidden, even when it is technically accessible, because access is not only a yes or no. Access is time. Access is patience. Access is knowing the right language to ask the right question. And tonight, that's what we're really circling. Not the fantasy of a single locked book, but the reality that an institution can manage truth by managing process. Many stories never become public because the path is exhausting. Years of waiting, languages to learn, rules to navigate, and exhaustion becomes its own kind of gatekeeper. And behind that fatigue, many things can remain undisturbed. And in that exhaustion, myths grow, because myths are easier than paperwork. The Vatican Archive holds about 85 kilometers of shelving. That number is almost impossible to comprehend in human terms. It would take a scholar working full-time, examining documents for 8 hours every day, multiple lifetimes just to look at everything, not to read it, not to understand it, simply to glance at each item for a few seconds before moving on. So the archive remains, in practical terms, inexhaustible. There will always be more material than any researcher or team of researchers can examine. There will always be collections that no living scholar has looked at. There will always be documents waiting in the dark for a request that may never come. And in that inexhaustibility, the mythology finds its foothold, because you cannot prove that something is not there. You can only say that no one has found it yet. But there are moments, documented in the accounts of scholars who have worked extensively in Vatican collections, when the passive silence seems to become something more active. Researchers have described experiences that are difficult to explain through bureaucratic indifference alone. Requests denied without clear reason, when similar requests from other scholars were granted. Documents that appear in old catalogues, with detailed descriptions, but that cannot be located when someone asks to see them. Collections that were once accessible to researchers, but are now closed, with no public explanation offered for the change in policy. Some of these experiences have mundane explanations. Documents are fragile, and access policies change when materials deteriorate. Collections are reorganized, and items that were once in one location may be moved to another without the catalogue being updated. Old catalogues contain errors, descriptions of materials that were planned but never acquired, or items that were misidentified by earlier archivists. But not all the experiences reported by scholars fit these patterns. Some researchers describe being directed away from certain lines of inquiry by archivists who seemed uncomfortable with their questions. Some have found references in one collection to materials that archivists insisted did not exist, then later discovered that other researchers, at other times, working with different archivists, were able to access those very materials. These accounts are anecdotal. They do not constitute proof of systematic concealment. Frustrated scholars may misremember or exaggerate their experiences. Institutional bureaucracies are inherently frustrating, and it is easy to attribute to malice what might be better explained by incompetence or simple miscommunication. But the accounts suggest, at minimum, that the passive silence sometimes has active edges, that somewhere in the institutional hierarchy, decisions are being made about what can be seen, and those decisions are not always made on the basis of publicly stated policies. Who makes those decisions? On what basis? With what oversight? With what accountability? The Vatican does not say. And in that refusal to explain, the silence deepens. Despite everything we have discussed tonight, the bureaucratic explanations, the archival mechanics, the reasonable accounts of how large institutions function, the mythology persists. Stories circulate of forbidden gospels that contradict the official Bible, of histories that place the Church in deeply uncomfortable light, of evidence suppressed for centuries that would shatter the foundations of Western religion if it were ever allowed to see the light of day. These stories are not new. They have been told in various forms for as long as the Church has existed. Each generation discovers them anew, convinced that they have uncovered something hidden from their parents and grandparents. These stories return for the same reason they always have. The mind dislikes opacity and fills it with shape. Part of the answer is psychological. The human mind is drawn to hidden patterns, secret knowledge, alternative explanations for the way things are. When the official story feels incomplete, and it always feels incomplete, because reality is always more complex than any narrative, we seek what is missing. The Church, with its long history and its acknowledged secrets, provides an ideal canvas for this seeking. It is old enough to have accumulated genuine mysteries. It is powerful enough to have plausibly concealed things. It is secretive enough to resist easy investigation by outsiders. So the imagination fills the gaps with whatever fears or hopes the seeker carries. For those who distrust religious authority, the hidden documents contain proof of church corruption. For those drawn to alternative histories, the hidden documents contain evidence of lost civilizations. For those who feel that modern life lacks meaning, the hidden documents contain ancient wisdom that has been deliberately kept from them. The stories adapt to their audience. They persist because they serve a purpose that has nothing to do with their factual accuracy. What purpose do they serve for you? What shape does your own uncertainty take? They fill the same need facts rarely satisfy, the feeling that the unknown has a shape. There is a human need for mystery that rationality cannot fully satisfy. We want there to be hidden chambers. We want there to be forbidden knowledge. We want to believe that somewhere, someone knows the truth, even if that truth is being kept from us. That wanting is itself a kind of mirror. What we imagine in the forbidden archive often says more about us than about the archive itself. This desire is ancient. It predates the Vatican, predates Christianity, predates even writing itself. The mystery cults of the ancient world, the secret teachings of the philosophers, the hidden names of gods that only initiates could speak. These are all expressions of the same impulse. The Vatican, with its long corridors and sealed collections, provides a perfect vessel for this impulse. It is old enough to be mysterious, powerful enough to be feared, secretive enough to resist easy explanation. And what fills the silence we project onto it? Our own unfinished thoughts. And so the stories gather around it like moths around a flame. Stories of forbidden gospels and hidden histories. Stories of documents that would change everything if only they could be revealed. Stories that promise the resolution of doubt, the end of uncertainty, the final answer to questions that have troubled humanity since we first looked up at the stars and wondered who put them there. But there is another part of the answer, and it is less comfortable for the institution that would prefer these stories simply go away. The stories persist because the Church gives them room to grow. Every time the Vatican refuses a reasonable request for access, the mythology gains strength. Every time an archivist cannot explain why a particular document is unavailable, trust erodes. Every time the institution responds to legitimate questions with silence, the silence is filled with speculation. This is not entirely the Church's fault. No institution can satisfy every demand for transparency. No archive can make every document available to everyone who wants to see it. There are legitimate reasons for restriction, and the Vatican is not unique in applying them. But the Church operates under a unique burden. It claims moral authority. It claims to be the guardian of truth. It claims a special relationship with the divine, a mandate to guide humanity towards salvation. When an institution makes such claims, the gap between its rhetoric and its practice becomes uniquely damaging. The same restrictions that would seem reasonable in a government archive or a corporate collection feel different, feel hypocritical, in an institution that presents itself as the keeper of sacred truth. When an institution claims moral authority, even ordinary restriction can feel like concealment. The Church has answers to this question: preservation of fragile materials, protection of privacy, the slow work of scholarship that cannot be rushed, the need to protect materials from misuse by those who would distort them for political purposes. These answers are reasonable. They are the same answers that any responsible archive would give, but they do not satisfy. They do not quiet the suspicion, because the Church has, at various points in its history, actively suppressed knowledge. It has burned books by the thousands. It has silenced scholars who asked inconvenient questions. It has rewritten histories to suit its institutional purposes. These are not conspiracy theories. They are documented facts, acknowledged by the Church itself. The Index of Forbidden Books existed for 4 centuries, listing works that Catholics were prohibited from reading. The Inquisition conducted investigations, trials, and punishments for intellectual as well as religious offences. The Church has, in living memory, resisted the release of documents related to its conduct during the Holocaust, its financial dealings, its handling of abuse allegations against clergy. So when the Church asks for trust, it asks from a position of diminished credibility. It asks those who know history to forget what history has taught them. This is the tragedy of institutional secrecy. Even when the secrets are mundane, the secrecy itself becomes corrosive. It poisons the relationship between the institution and those it claims to serve. And then something happens. A scholar publishes. Publishing is not a thunderclap. It's more like a slow sunrise. A document emerges as a quotation in a paper, then as a footnote in a book, then as a translated excerpt, then as a conversation in a lecture hall. And if the subject is sensitive, the first public version is rarely dramatic. It's careful. It's cautious. It's written in a language that doesn't go viral. And that creates an odd effect. The archive can release information without the public ever noticing. Most discoveries don't arrive like thunder. They arrive like footnotes. They surface quietly, in scholarship, where attention rarely lingers. And if attention is the gatekeeper, what does that say about the truths we never hear? And sometimes truth is released softly enough that the world barely notices. Not because anyone is censoring you, but because attention is its own gatekeeper. So we arrive at a simple edge. What we can say clearly, and what we can only hold as uncertainty. We have examined the Vatican archive, not as a vault of forbidden knowledge, but as an institution, vast, old, and operating according to its own internal logic. We have traced the parallels between ancient Mesopotamian texts and the Hebrew scriptures. We have considered what might have been preserved from the ancient world, what might have been lost, and what might simply be waiting, uncatalogued and unexamined, for someone to find. Let us be honest, as we approach the end of this journey, about what we actually know and what we do not. We know that the Vatican archive exists and contains an enormous quantity of documents spanning nearly 1,000 years of institutional history. We know that access is restricted, not uniformly closed, but not freely open either. Qualified scholars can examine some materials. Other materials remain sealed, some temporarily and some indefinitely. We know that the cataloguing is incomplete. The Vatican itself acknowledges that significant portions of its holdings have never been fully inventoried. Materials exist in those corridors that no living person has examined. We know that the Church has, at various points in its history, actively shaped the historical record. It has decided which texts were canonical and which were apocryphal. It has suppressed some writings and promoted others. It has managed narratives to serve institutional interests. We know that parallels exist between biblical texts and older Mesopotamian traditions. The scholarly consensus is that influence occurred, though the nature and meaning of that influence remain subjects of legitimate debate. We know that the Church acquired materials from many sources over many centuries, from dissolved religious orders, from conquered territories, from the ruins of civilizations the Church outlasted. Some of these materials have been examined by scholars, others have not. These are facts. They are not sensational, but they are significant. What do we do with significant facts that don't give us the drama we crave? We hold them gently and resist the urge to inflate them. They tell us that the archive is real, that it contains multitudes, and that access to those multitudes is controlled in ways that are not fully transparent. They tell us that the history we think we know is built on a foundation of sources, and that those sources are not all equally available. They tell us that institutions shape knowledge, not always through malice, but simply through the accumulated weight of their decisions over time. This is not the same as saying the Vatican is hiding proof of something impossible, or suppressing evidence of pre-human civilizations, or concealing documents that would overturn everything we believe. But it is also not nothing. The gap between mundane bureaucratic restrictions and deliberate suppression of forbidden knowledge is vast. Most of what the Vatican does falls into the first category. But the first category is enough to create conditions where genuine surprises could remain hidden for centuries. Is that reassuring? Or does it make the unknown feel even larger? And that is the disquieting truth at the heart of this story. We do not need conspiracy to explain the persistence of mystery. We only need scale and time and the limits of human attention. For some, that feels comforting. For others, it feels like the opposite. Something may still be waiting in those corridors, not dramatically hidden, just quietly unrequested. And in a decade or a century, when different questions are finally asked, something may surface that no one expected. It would likely look small, a footnote, a ledger line, a quiet shift in dates. Now for what we do not know. We do not know with any certainty what specific documents the Vatican holds relating to pre-Christian religions. We have hints and fragments, references and rumors, but no comprehensive accounting. We do not know why certain collections remain sealed while others have been opened. The Vatican does not publish detailed explanations for its access decisions. We do not know what materials might have been lost, destroyed, or removed from the archive over the centuries. The gaps in the record are, by definition, undocumented. We do not know whether any documents exist that would substantially revise our understanding of Christian origins, ancient history, or human civilization. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is speculation proof of presence. We do not know what the next generation of scholars might find when collections currently sealed are eventually opened, as some inevitably will be. History has taught us that surprises emerge from archives. We cannot predict their nature or their significance. These unknowns are genuine. They are not the product of paranoid imagination. They arise from the structure of the archive itself, from the nature of institutional secrecy, from the simple fact that vast collections resist total comprehension by any individual or even any generation. The temptation, when faced with uncertainty, is to fill it with certainty of our own making, to declare that the secrets are definitely this or definitely that, to convert suspicion into conviction, speculation into claim. But that path leads away from understanding. It trades genuine mystery for manufactured answers. It substitutes the satisfaction of certainty for the discomfort of honest doubt. And the silence answers nothing. Real evidence, if it exists, would likely look quiet. What does quiet evidence sound like? A margin note, a correction, a date that doesn't match the official story. Not sensational evidence, not the kind that ends the conversation, the kind that changes a timeline by a few degrees. A letter that contradicts the official story. A ledger that shows a text existed earlier than we thought. A margin note that reveals doubt in a moment we assumed was certain. A report from far away describing a belief system that mirrors an older myth. Evidence like that doesn't scream, it whispers. Many whispers never become part of history simply because no one listens long enough. And because it whispers, it can be ignored, or misused, or turned into a headline that promises too much. So tonight, let's stay sleep honest. If the Vatican guards documents older than Christianity, the most likely revelation is not pre-human civilization confirmed. The most likely revelation is something quieter, that history is not a straight line, that beliefs overlap, that institutions inherit more than they admit, that the past survives in strange places and then gets renamed. And then there is the last thought, the one that keeps the story alive. If you could read every document, you might not feel safer. You might simply realize that certainty was always the illusion, and that questions, not answers, are what keep us honest. The Vatican archive remains genuinely mysterious, not because it definitely hides forbidden knowledge, but because it is too large, too old, and too opaque for anyone to fully comprehend. The mystery is structural, not conspiratorial. It arises from the nature of institutions, not from the malice of individuals. This may seem like a less satisfying conclusion than confident claims about hidden impossibilities or suppressed gospels or proof of pre-human civilizations. But it has the advantage of being honest. We do not know what is in there. No one does. Not fully. And that uncertainty, carried without false resolution, is more truthful than any confident claim. And so we reach the edge of what can honestly be said. Not a revelation, not a verdict, just the shape of an archive, and the shape of a human mind facing something too large to fully see. We do know a few simple truths. We know the archive exists. We know it contains centuries of records. We know access is controlled through process, qualifications, permissions, catalogues, priorities. And we know that in any archive this vast, some things remain unvisited for reasons that are ordinary, and some things remain difficult for reasons that are never fully explained. But the rest, the dramatic claims, the confident conclusions, that is where the story becomes more like desire than evidence. So tonight we do something quieter. We hold the uncertainty without trying to force it into certainty. If you could open every door, you might not feel calmer. You might simply see, more clearly, how layered and incomplete history always is. And maybe that is the most honest thing this story can offer. What do institutions manage in the end? Not truth itself, but the pace at which truth becomes visible. That institutions manage truth not only by what they say, but by what they make searchable, and how long they can afford to wait. If your attention drifts here, let it drift. You don't need to hold every detail, just the feeling of a long corridor and the soft weight of time. Somewhere beneath the marble, documents rest in dark, stable air, not as answers, as records. And tonight, that is enough. Good night.